I guess on that note, maybe this is the perfect time to bring out our guest, Matt Karp. Matt, of course, is a frequent, not unfamiliar face on the Jacobin channel, but I believe this is who is this guy? Some random person who is
just another bearded Brooklynite. Yep,
exactly
right. City slicker.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, poor rural Philadelphia. I'm playing. Sorry.
Exactly.
In all seriousness, Matt Karp, of course, Jacobin contributing editor. He is also associate professor of history at Princeton. He's the author of the book, This Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy. And we are going to talk to him, among other things, about his recent essay in Jacobin, which is The Politics of a Second Gilded Age, which came out in the winter print issue. So again, Matt, welcome to the Jacobin Show. What's new?
What's new? I'm just embodying, as I do every day, embodying all of the changes in our politics that I ostensibly rail against as a professorial Brooklyn socialist. So I'm just living that paradox, like we all are, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right. Gotta live your truth.
So talk to us about the Gilded Age, both the old Gilded Age and the new Gilded Age. In your article, you draw a connection between, the Gilded Age of yore and the kind of politics that we see unfolding now. And I think that most people are probably pretty familiar with the Gilded Age, the first Gilded Age, as this moment of extreme economic inequality, hence the name. And of course, lots of commentators and politicians have referred to the time that we're living in now as the new Gilded Age. So what is the connection between the two time periods? And what's most interesting about politics, electoral politics between these two eras?
Yeah, I mean, I just sort of hit on that analogy as mostly as almost as a sort of provocation to sort of think beyond the typical sort of fare that we get in sort of most liberal media, where everything is analogized to historically to the Second World War or the Civil War. Those are the kind of, History Channel things that we're working with. They're both very useful, to inspire or to, in some cases, discipline, various forms of left politics. I'm, of course, guilty as anyone of using various Civil War analogies again and again and again, and I will not stop doing that. I don't think. But thinking about 2020, I mean, the things that jumped out at me when, really in a lot of ways, looking at the numbers, were the extent to which this was there were three things, right? This was a really high turnout election. People, ran to their ballots in this Trump-Biden election, which we had kind of, especially on the left, had kind of imagined and sort of scoffed at as like the sort of almost a caricature of an unpalatable, out of touch, anachronistic, these two ancient dinosaurs like stumbling towards the White House, clearly unfit for the office, mentally, ideologically. And yet, the Trump-Biden election got far more voters than any election with Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton or any of the sort of dynamite political talents of our era. It brought things back. Actually, you have to go back 100 years to get up to, 67% turnout. So something's going on there. And that high turnout, which broke a lot of the narratives that we'd been working with, and combined with what a lot of people have observed as really intense negative partisanship, where this turnout is driven primarily not by a kind of adulation or a deep identification with a movement or even certainly a set of ideas, but with opposition and kind of a deep-seated antagonism towards the other guy, which isn't a new thing in American politics, obviously, or any form of politics. It's always about, friends and enemies. But the negative end of that stick has really grown larger and heavier in recent years. And then and there's various ways to look at that and measure that. But then the third thing is the thing that is like my kind of, as I said, my kind of self-contradictory beat, which is about class dealignment and how the Democratic coalition keeps getting, keeps getting further and further removed from its New Deal era, or even mid 20th century working class base, or even frankly its 2008 working class base, which was really sort of the point of the article, is that, even leaving aside this long-term change away from the Democrats as a party where most working class people supported, you don't even have to talk about the difference between Biden and FDR or LBJ. You can just talk about the difference between the Biden coalition and the Obama coalition, which is really significant and striking in places like Michigan, where where Barack Obama rolled up massive working class majorities among Black voters in Detroit, and among white workers in the sort of deindustrializing old auto and industrial areas. And Biden didn't underperformed in both those groups of workers really dramatically, and compensated by winning traditionally Republican, suburban, professional class, managerial class strongholds. So you're all familiar with this argument probably by now, but I think this is a really long-winded way to get there, back to the Gilded Age. But in other words, this three-part combination of basically intense politics, intense negative partisanship, high turnout, intense negative partisanship, and a politics that's driven by culture, geography, a kind of, in effect, partisan identity, rather than anything to do with class in terms of the basis of the coalitions. It really reminded me nothing of the 20th century, or even really the Civil War era in particular, but the electoral politics, not the larger social context, but specifically the party system of the Gilded, and to some extent the progressive era of the Gilded Age, and to some extent the progressive era in the turn of the century, 1880s to around 1910. There's a new book by a historian named John Greenspan called The Age of Acrimony that compiles this sort of this era together, really hitting a lot of these same notes. And it's not that significant economic policy didn't happen, or significant class politics were happening in an incredibly intense, embodied, material way, and in mines and on dockyards and in all sorts of. This is the heroic era of labor organization and anti-labor violence. But very little of that made its way into the electoral system. And to the extent that various parties, different parties in different times supported different things, none of their positions on the tariff, or their positions on currency, or any of the other kind of economic issues of that period, really, in terms of Democrats and Republicans, translated into anything like a structural economic change, or anything like a class politics. And I guess the failure, and we're on a steam engine train towards a similar set of politics, right? Where we have intense, feverish debate about a lot of issues, and some economic policy, significant economic policy differences between Republicans and Democrats. We don't need to pretend those don't exist. But decoupled from class politics, can those policy differences become structural changes, fundamental changes? I'm very skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess I want to quickly follow up on that by noting something I really like in your article is you kind of zero in on certain districts to look at how they voted and what kinds of policies they supported to make your case about partisan identity and partisan identity politics, and also class de-alignment. So you point out in various, wealthy suburbs, I think Barrington, Illinois is probably, I think that's one of the examples you cite, you see voters flocking to Joe Biden, yet at the same time,
Cavallari country. Sorry,
is it? I mean, totally, yeah, definitely. But at the same time, they're rejecting initiatives to tax the rich or to raise the minimum wage. So you could say that they are, voting blue, but at the same time not backing kind of pro-working class measures. Then, on the other hand, I believe the example you cite is Sweetwater, Florida, which broke for Trump, or shifted to Trump, but at the same time, overwhelmingly supported Florida's $15 minimum wage ballot initiative. And that's so interesting to me because, or I guess something that I'm wondering is, do you see an opportunity for the left in here, or is this just a total disaster? This kind of like weird mismatch?
Yeah, it's very, very frustrating. And I think on the front score, I mean, we can debate the different political context for a lot of these initiatives. And there is, some people will push back and say, actually, depends on the initiative, the state, the situation. Some upper middle class voters do seem to be more willing in this Democratic coalition to support tax increases, et cetera. But there's a lot of evidence that willingness is really capped, is limited, and is certainly not, in my view, capable of supporting the much larger, more sweeping redistributive measures that we would need for anything like a Bernie-ish agenda, much less, something beyond that. So that's a real problem that I don't think that the sort of new architects of progressivism in this vein have really figured out. I think they're kind of deferring it in a sense out of necessity. And this is where, this is the sticking point. It's not the case, unfortunately, that the left has a clear answer about how to get all those, Sweetwater Latinos to sort of basically vote their class, or to get the Upper Peninsula working class white people to vote their class. The Democrats have failed. The Democrats haven't really failed. They've done exactly what they wanted. Chuck Schumer, et cetera, has made it clear 100 times. This is the coalition that wing of the Democratic Party wants, precisely because it affords, the party a kind of stable voting base that isn't dependent on real economic redistribution, and yet will support the kind of, piecemeal social reforms and to some extent the one step forward, two step back economic changes that Paul was discussing. So they're getting what they want. We're not getting what we want. But the problem is we don't have a clear answer about how to win back those voters. And the harder truth that you just have to spit it straight here on the Jacobin YouTube is that even our socialist candidates have, by and large, are great victories. Cory Bush, here in New York, Jabari Brisport, who I campaigned for, these, candidates who've won working class districts have largely won, at least at the primary level, by mobilizing more middle class, professional class, younger voters. So, it's not like we have we have a magic formula or a silver bullet to do this. I do think though the first step would be recognizing that this is a problem and making this a priority rather than
celebrating or
And I think part of that problem, is that it can't really be done purely through an electoral campaign or a series of electoral campaigns, because by their very nature, you're in this limited time frame trying to quickly mobilize voters, and you're always going to be wanting to mobilize people who are more likely to vote. And again, it's not an argument, of course, against elections and against doing primaries, but like there has to be another element to this piece, because we can't just be doing this through an electoral campaign.
Absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
I want to go back to the Gilded Age analogy because, the first Gilded Age sort of famously ended when the progressive era was ushered in. And then, of course, we had the New Deal, which arguably marked the kind of like high period of class voting, at least in the US, for a number of decades. So I'm wondering if there's anything from that kind of transitionary period that you think can help sort of guide us through this like awful moment of class de-alignment right now.
Yeah, how do we run the New Deal again? Yeah,
exactly. That's what I'm asking you.
Paul, what are your thoughts?
Do the good thing again? I just want to do the good thing again.
We just stop making the bad stuff happen and make the good stuff happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is not where this is my specialty as a historian. So I do think that, we've been sort of dabbling in various New Deal book clubs and so on to try to make sense of this era, because I do think there are some answers there. And I think to some extent, even a certain class of, mainstream liberals and progressives are coming around to this view. I saw Jamel Bouie's column, who, I don't agree with about everything, but he wrote a column kind of actually lionizing the New Deal as a series of as a sort of a political movement that didn't just equalize the economy, but help save American democracy. So I do think that there are forces out there that want to think about this, that aren't just on the sort of the Jacobin left. But I think, look, if we have to be structural here for a minute, we have to be materialist. I'm actually, as anyone who reads me closely could probably tell, I'm not a very good materialist intellectually, but I think the conditions of our of working class struggle today are just very, very different than they were in the industrial era. And I think that's not to say that it's impossible to organize workers in warehouses or to organize workers at in hospitals, or to organize the different kinds of much more atomized often, and if not contingent, if not explicitly contingent, and sort of really peripheralized, marginalized workers that make up most of the working class today. But it is a very different situation. So I don't think we can exactly expect to get to sort of run that tape back. That being said, I think it would also be a mistake to go too far in the other direction, where people say, wait, hey, the New Deal era is over, so let's forget about it. Let's actually drop the nostalgia for that kind of working class politics and just forge an entirely new way forward that more or less is indifferent to huge sections of the existing working class, of the sort of traditional working class, which still exists, in order to sort of sustain this progressive momentum. I think that would be disastrous. Also, if you've noticed, I answer most of your questions about what we should do by saying, well, here's something we shouldn't do. But I guess this is where I get to do a little bit of happy dodging and saying, as a historian, I'm not an organizer. I support these movements, but I don't have the answers for how to fix the future.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Why haven't you ushered in single-handedly a new deal, Matt?
Right.
That's why we brought you on the show.
Yeah, working on it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you talk about in the article about class dealignment, that this is not inevitable; it's a choice. And I mean, as you cite in the article as well, class dealignment is happening all over the world in these different labor parties, socialist parties, social democratic parties. This same process is happening. So, I mean, one could say, if it's happening everywhere, this is inevitable. There's nothing we can do. So can you kind of talk about why you think it's not inevitable? And also, like, how is this playing out? How is the Democratic Party leadership, making this inevitable?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. This is the most sort of serious, pushback, I would say, from progressives engaged in electoral politics, is to say, look, this is a transatlantic, half-century long trend that has afflicted all sorts of, socialist, social democratic, labor, working class parties in, so many different contexts. And there's obviously truth to that. There are broader forces, basically, that have to do with the transformations and evolutions within capitalism, globalization, automation, the particular political struggles of the 1960s and 70s, which basically went capital's way, and the consequent weakening of labor unions, et cetera, pretty much everywhere. So these are things that we have to contend in. We're born, despite these sort of recent victories, as I squeak out our recent victories in the Bernie era, we are still a generation born in the wake of just a mammoth defeat. So I think recognizing that is one starting point. So, as I think I said after Bernie's loss, we're finally strong enough to realize how weak we are. And it's a long, long haul back. And so there are these massive forces arrayed against, class politics in almost every context. And so I don't want to pretend that this is just about like Chuck Schumer's calculated malice or something like that. That being said, I think it's also true that these are artifacts of certain kinds of political struggle. And if you look at the numbers in different contexts, if you look at, say, how the difference between the Obama campaign and the Biden campaign in the US, you see not just broader trends that are working against class politics, but you see the calculated malice of Chuck Schumer. You see the way in which the sort of both the political rhetoric and the style and the kind of milieu of the Democratic Party, from those ubiquitous, love is love lawn signs that don't mention any material issue, to its kind of various positionings on economic versus social issues. Two, it's to the extent to which it offers, limp but essentially a pretty for the last 40 years, very either direct hostility to labor or a very soft support for it. You see all sorts of ways in which these calculated decisions, both on the policy front and on the campaign trail, on the politics front, have produced this coalition that they want. And just because it also happened in say the UK or elsewhere doesn't mean that it wasn't calculated there too, that these weren't political struggles that were waged and fought in these different contexts. Because you also see, for instance, if you look at the Corbyn campaign, at least some of the sort of de-alignment based on wealth was reversed by Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, which is a really striking thing in the context of 40, 50 years of de-alignment. And Obama in 2008 also, there were twinkles of a different kind of a reversal, even in certainly in income polarization and to some extent in education polarization. Obama did really well with working class candidates of all races in comparison to, say, John Kerry, Al Gore, et cetera. And I think it's time I think we should think about to what extent he did well, not because he was a Ivy League law grad, but because he, which he was, because Obama himself was obviously not a working class hero, but to the extent to which that 2008 campaign really powerfully, engaged in the theater of populist, bottom up, working in a sense, a kind of not a socialist sort of working class politics, but a kind of the whole si se puede, yes we can energy of that campaign absolutely drew its strength on an idea of mass democratic politics from below, which is very different from the Biden campaign. And I'm not saying that the aesthetics of the campaign are the things that deliver every vote, but Obama himself, obviously a kind of embodiment of an outsider, whatever his actual class position, whatever his actual ideology, which proved very centrist. But his the sort of the way in which he represented something else and something outside the mainstream is not hard to recognize. So this is an example. In a funny way, it's an odd example for the left because I don't want people to think that I'm lionizing the 2008 campaign specifically, because it obviously was so many broken promises on any number of levels. But I do think there are things to learn about a certain kind of style of politics that says, wait a minute, there are different, even within our shrinking, defeated world, there are different paths. There are different ways in which this can accelerate or this can be slowed down, or maybe in some cases this can even be reversed, and I do think that there are electoral lessons there.
I want to follow that up by asking you about identity politics. Partisan identity politics is obviously sort of the main focus of your piece. But I guess just for me personally, I notice among a lot of the, I guess you could say, the liberal commentariat, there's often an assumption that partisan identity and racial identity have a large overlap, right? So after the 2020 election, you heard a lot of talk Black women saved us or Black voters saved us, right? And after 2016, there was sort of the opposite, where you heard a lot about white women, selling out other women, or the white working class. That's kind of race and class, but the white working class or white voters got us Trump. And so I guess I was wondering if you could talk about how identity politics is sort of a different creature from class politics and why that is. And then follow up, is there a connection between partisan identity and racial identity at all?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of using, sort of partisan identity in a slightly mischievous way because, without sort of, going head on at the kind of eternal identity politics question. But I mean, if you look at the numbers, obviously the trends, I don't think this is news, but it was already kind of clear in 2016, but it was especially clear it became really clear in 2020 that, we know for a long time that the Republican Party has been primarily, the backbone of the Republican Party has been white voters, and that non-white voters by and large do not vote Republican. That's been the case. That was the case when it was Romney versus Obama. We didn't talk about it in those terms in the same way, at least as obsessively in the liberal media, for any number of reasons. But that was even more true in 2012 than it was in 2016. We saw those numbers. And in 2020, that was even less true. So, what's actually happening is, in my view, if you demographically, if you look at and I'm not the only one to say this. This is something that liberal commentators like David Shore have talked about. That basically class polarization to an extent, or education polarization, is trumping racial polarization, because you have large numbers, especially of Latino, but to some extent Asian immigrant voters, and to some extent, in a smaller but still noticeable way, Black voters moving away from the Democratic camp, either to not voting or to some extent with Latinos and Asians voting for Trump and for Republicans. So in terms of trends, I think I think we're past the point where we can simply describe our party system as being intensely more racialized than it ever has been before. That's just not true in terms of the sort of rainbow coalition that Trump assembled. Now, of course, you don't want to overstate that. You don't want to. A trend is different from a flat reality. The truth is, most non-white voters, most non-white working class voters, did still vote Democrat. And the biggest problem that Democrats have, the biggest problem in class polarization, is still the biggest chunk of working class voters, white voters, who are also are trending Republican. So it's complicated to sort out. But my point about partisan identity politics is that this, to be honest, this, alongside with this sort of education polarization or class de-alignment, this kind of identification, the way in which voters increasingly identify almost beyond their own specific personal identity, whether it's racial, ethnic, gender, geographic, religious, whether they identify with a certain sort of political brand or specifically against a partisan political brand, seems to me really heightened in this era of national of negative partisanship. And that kind of that sort of like who all that discourse of who can you or who can't you talk to as a Trump voter, are we allowed to speak to Trump voters on the holidays? Are these people even do they have material form for us, or are they sort of raving animal zombies? This is just on the left center, you see this, but obviously it's true on the right too, in terms of the idea that every Democrat is a raving Antifa terrorist. And that kind of heightened partisan identity, it's like, I'm defined by not being a part of this loathsome other that operates almost strictly along the lines of red versus blue. To me, that really, really undermines the deeper we go in that territory. I really worry that undermines the possibility of reaching out to those Sweetwater, Florida voters, those working class Latinos who said, hey, wait a minute, I like minimum wage. I like the minimum wage. A lot of people I know would benefit from this. I'm voting for that. But the more we drive them, our kind of partisan machine drives them into being like, yeah, but I'm a Republican. I'm a Trump guy. The more that happens, actually, the less likely they're going to vote for a Democratic initiative that's identified in partisan terms with the Democrats, whatever its class content is. So that's dangerous on current trends. If class de-alignment weren't happening, then partisanship would be great. If the Democrats were becoming more and more working class, I would be thrilled about Democratic partisanship. I don't actually think partisanship itself is a problem, but partisanship in this context, on these terms, I think is dangerous.
And you kind of already are starting to touch on this, but to follow up on that, can you explain the dangers of left-wing and socialist candidates kind of leaning into this Team Blue partisan identity, even if it's good in the short term for fundraising, which I think is why they do it? And I know you're not an organizer, but how do left-wing electeds break out of this? How do they stop doing this? Yeah,
to be honest, that part of the piece is more targeted at the sort of at in my view, at socialist or lefty, the kind of post-Bernie Bernie-crat left in electoral politics. Because the truth is, most Democratic politicians are going to lean into partisanship. That's our system. And I'm not trying to say that we should bring back, bipartisan posturing or bring back, some sort of anti-political or anti-partisan, the sort of the grandeur of distance from these, pox on both their houses kind of business. But I think so, but I think the truth is for the squad style politics, they've been playing. It's a tightrope, and I'm sure every single one of them would acknowledge this, that there's a tightrope between, in effect, working with the Democratic leadership and the Democratic brand, if you will, and kind of maintaining influence and sort of support from a lot of sort of intense Democratic partisans, and identify and sort of carving out some kind of independent identity. And as a whether it's a sort of a left-wing identity or a sort of a working class based identity or some sort of other, and I don't mean identity as in terms of individual identity, I mean political identity. What differentiates the Bernie the Bernie-crats from the Democrats, et cetera. And to me, it's really risky for the strategy to basically be like, we just want everything that the Democrats say they want, but we just want more of it. And we are the most intense Democrats. And we show that by hating Republicans the most, tangling with Republicans the most, organizing, deepening the sense in which all politics is, who said what to who in a kind of, feverish take and counter take cycle between the two parties where, you have the good guys and the bad guys. And I think you did see a lot of this. This was really heightened after the Capitol riot, et cetera, where that's the only thing, that's the only dividing line in politics. That's the binary. And when that becomes the only binary, then there's no distance between, there's no sense in which any kind of post-Bernie kind of politics has any difference from Nancy Pelosi's politics. And look, I mean, I understand to some extent, like, this election just happened. You're trying to do things in a party that now has a really slender majority. I do understand the tactical logic of leaning into that, but I think there are a lot of dangers associated with that strategy too, that basically make the left wing of the Democratic Party, in a sense, almost the most kind of de-aligned portion of the Democratic Party. That, in some ways, and I think if you looked at the numbers, to some extent, there is some truth to that the Progressive Caucus, I don't know, maybe that goes too far. I shouldn't say that, because a lot of the new, kind of professional class Democrats are in the new Democrat caucus. So I won't go there, but I think basically it puts, Bernie politics in a box that is in fact at the mercy of Pelosi and Schumer. And I can see why you want to do that in order to claim victories and say, hey, we helped get you your $2,000, like, go for that. And I'm not saying that they should be, completely hold their noses from this stuff, but I think there needs to be a concerted effort to sort of build a political identity that is at least to some extent independent from that puts, working class and, left-wing economic redistributive questions, Medicare for all, jobs for all, to some extent, Green New Deal, support for labor, puts all of that as this is our political identity that is actually, we're way more loyal to these issues than we are to Team Blue.
Yeah, and it's such a strange phenomenon how in the last Gilded Age and in this one, when economic inequality is at its most extreme, culture war issues still rise to dominate political life. So, what explains this? How does that happen when economic inequality is so stark, it's staring you in the face, but culture war is still where everything pivots on?
Yeah, I mean, a cynical explanation is that it sort of serves the interests of the short term and maybe the long term interests of both the sort of partisan political leadership and ultimately the kind of capitalist ruling class, which has no problem kind of having a culture war between Facebook and Shell Oil. Or whatever, between various sections of capital that seem to be like identified with certain kinds of progressive politics versus others that are, cast as the villains. You guys were talking about woke capitalism before. I mean, clearly these very powerful forces in our society don't fear this, nor do they fear, partisan, polarization around these issues. So I think that's a big part of it. I think it also has to do with, to what extent does the organized working class have the power to disrupt that paradigm? and during the Gilded Age, they didn't. They were too busy, being murdered by Pinkertons, basically, and also too divided by, brutal, racial and ethnic divisions, within themselves, frankly, which are a big part of that story, and made, working class organization very difficult in late 19th century America in some places. Although there were also enormous triumphs that were only beaten down by the state. So we're kind of in that position now, although fortunately, union organizers aren't being murdered. That's the good news. The bad news is we probably have, the intensity of mobilization within, labor politics is not as fierce as it was, say, in the Haymarket era, in the sort of the general strikes of the 1870s. We're not really there yet in terms of actually mobilizing workers, as we saw, really brutally in the Alabama Amazon vote. We're very, very, even though the rules are more favorable to us, but the actual workers are not right now. So, there's a lot of work to do on that front, but I think that's the only way to break through this. As long as the working class is itself divided, disorganized, and weak, you're going to have a politics that's primarily culture with, a few arguments about tax rates on the side.